Known as a soldier scholar, he reshaped modern counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan and became one of the most influential and well-known American generals of his generation. However, in his later career, he would be criticised by some for being more politician than soldier. Today, we're going to look at the military career and campaigns of General David Petraeus. Recently, I've had a lot of requests to cover more modern era military commanders and generals. And in prior videos, we've touched on the likes of Major General Sir Julian Thompson, Sir Peter de la Billière, Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell. But today, I really wanted to focus on a military commander who had a major influence on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conflicts that shaped my generation and especially those who served in uniform. Whatever your view is of General Petraeus, there's no doubt that he played a significant and lasting role in this particular part of military history. David Howell Petraeus was born in November 1952 in Cornwall-on-Hudson, an historic village along the Hudson River in New York State, about 50 miles north of New York City and 7 miles north of West Point. His mother was a librarian from Brooklyn, and his father was a Dutch merchant marine captain. His father was at sea during World War II when the Germans invaded Holland, and he couldn't return to his home country, so instead headed to the US and offered his services in the US merchant fleet. Petraeus' father would then participate in the dangerous Arctic convoys up to Murmansk. Serving in the merchant fleet during World War II was no picnic, and it had one of the highest Allied per capita casualty rates. His parents would meet during the war in New York, and Petraeus' father now settled down in the US. After the war, and not wanting to be away for long periods of time, Petraeus' father took on a job as an operating control engineer in a power station, and the family settled down in Cornwall-on-Hudson. Petraeus described Cornwall as a lovely place to grow up, and his parents, being fans of history, every summer would take him on local historic tours, such as retracing the steps of Paul Revere. And as anyone knows on this channel, we don't like to talk about that little small part of history. Isn't that right, Mel? Growing up in the shadow of the US Military Academy at West Point, Petraeus developed a strong interest in military service from a young age. As a teenager, he took a job as a paperboy for a couple of years, and many of his customers were mainly staff employed at the college or graduates. The young Petraeus was impressed by their demeanour and was inspired by the West Point cadets in the area. And so, as the saying goes, he decided to be like Mike, and around the age of 17 applied for West Point. Although his father may have possibly liked the young Petraeus to go to Annapolis and follow a naval path, he decided on the army and was successful in his application and entered West Point in the summer of 1970. Highly competitive by nature, Petraeus thrived at West Point. He embraced the Academy's demanding blend of academic rigour, leadership training and athletic discipline, finding in it a rewarding mix of challenges that suited both his temperament and his ambitions. Petraeus found that this blend of academia, leadership and athletics on the curriculum was the ideal foundation for the infantry, and he decided that was the branch he would go into. Petraeus competed on West Point's intercollegiate soccer and ski teams, served as a cadet captain on the brigade staff and earned recognition as a distinguished cadet, graduating in the top 5% of the class of 1974. I think 40th overall. He was also a varsity letterman. During his time there, Petraeus and other cadets would try minor acts of rebellion. We would grow our sideburns as long as you could. I guess it was the 70s. Petraeus attended West Point at the tail end of the Vietnam War, and many of his instructors were veterans. This would seed the beginnings of a lifelong fascination with the theory and practice of counterinsurgency warfare. Upon his graduation, Petraeus was then commissioned as a second lieutenant in June 1974. Petraeus then went to Ranger School, which is one of the US Army's toughest leadership courses. Candidates would have to endure extreme physical exercise, sometimes only getting one meal a day, precious little sleep, and having to take command decisions under intense pressure and scrutiny. During Petraeus' time, the course was about 8.5 weeks, I believe. For our UK viewers, I think loosely it's a combination of our Brecon Infantry Battle School and Platoon Commander's Battle Course, but don't quote me on that. I'm sure you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Former submariner here, so not too au fait on all these infantry courses. Facing leadership tests under enormous pressure, calorie deprived, and suffering immense fatigue, Petraeus graduated top of his course and reportedly even broke the point record at the time. After completing Ranger School, he was then assigned to the 509th Airborne Battalion Combat Team, a light infantry unit stationed in Vicenza, Italy. During his time there, he would be promoted to First Lieutenant in 1976. Petraeus would then be transferred to the 24th Mechanised Infantry Division at Fort Stewart in Georgia, and after a time as Assistant Operations Officer would be promoted to Captain and given command of a company in the 19th Infantry Regiment within the division. In 1981, Petraeus became an aide to General John Galvin, then Commanding General of the division. Galvin was seen as an intellectual soldier who focused on counterinsurgency doctrine and strategy. Petraeus would come to view Galvin as a close mentor and would shape his view on leadership and how warfare should be conducted. Interestingly, as an aside, Galvin, apparently as a West Point cadet, was implicated in the kidnap and abduction of Annapolis Naval Academy's chief mascot, Bill the Goat. A year later, Petraeus would go on to Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Petraeus would be the youngest attendee out of 1,200 students and come top of his class. From 1983 to 85, he studied for a PhD at Princeton. He would focus on counterinsurgency, which is interesting as at the time it wasn't that fashionable in the post-Vietnam environment and facing the Soviet threat. His dissertation was on how the US military learnt and failed to learn lessons from the Vietnam War. Promoted to major in 1985, he would then teach for a couple of years as an instructor and teacher at West Point. Here, he taught in the Department of Social Sciences. During his time at the faculty, Petraeus taught subjects such as political science, military strategy, and international relations. This aided him for future roles requiring political and diplomatic skills in addition to military talent. It's here that Petraeus' reputation as a soldier scholar would start to emerge. In the late 80s, he would then go on to spend time in Europe and do a stint as an aide to the US Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C. Petraeus would miss out on being deployed to the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. Upon promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, Petraeus then moved from the office of the Chief of Staff to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where he commanded the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault's 3rd Battalion, the 187th Infantry Regiment, known as the Iron Rakkasans, between 91 and 93. As an interesting aside, around over a decade later, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary of the US, would also serve with the same outfit in Iraq. Petraeus gained a reputation for competitiveness and excellence. His battalion reportedly had 3 times the enlisted Ranger qualified personnel of any other battalion in the division. As a commander, Petraeus led by example, pushing himself alongside his soldiers in physical training and frequently turning workouts into push-up or fitness competitions between himself and the rank and file. Petraeus wrote, "The only thing better than a little competition is a lot of competition. Set challenges for your subordinates to encourage them to excel." Throughout his career, and as he progressed into more senior positions, Petraeus would have a reputation for beating soldiers 10 years, 20 years younger than him even, in physical competitions such as runs, etc. The man just seemed like a machine. During his time at the battalion, in a live-fire exercise, Petraeus was accidentally shot in the chest by a soldier who tripped coming out of a bunker, firing off his M16. The bullet passed through his chest, causing severe injury. I was lucky. The gunshot wound was over the A in Petraeus rather than the A in Army. Petraeus would praise the combat medics that treated him. They did it perfectly, right in accordance with the soldier's manual. Taping battery plastic all over the exit wound, getting an IV running, and so on. He described the wound as one of the most painful physical experiences of his life. He said, "I do recall a number of strange looks whilst awaiting surgery, which later I realised resulted from me having various shades of green camouflage paint on my face." Despite the severity of the wound, Petraeus recovered quickly and was determined to return to duty. He soon became a headache for medical staff, performing dozens of push-ups in front of them and walking laps around the hospital to prove to them that he could be released. The experience would later shape him as a soldier and a leader, literally being able to understand what soldiers went through when they were wounded. I think that experience gave me a sense of what our soldiers experience when wounded or seriously injured. And many thoughts go through one's head at such a time. Although he would gain a reputation as a diplomat, Petraeus was not reticent in giving opinions to seniors. When one general came to take command of the division, he asked the more junior Petraeus for advice. Petraeus gave him a list of thoughts that included replacing a number of senior officers in the post. On reading Petraeus's report, the general called him into his office and said, "The information was valuable, thank you. Are there any more copies of this? And if so, I would like you to destroy them." Throughout his career, Petraeus would value the opinions of junior officers and stated that one should promote and protect the iconoclasts. They are the ones who can tell you the emperor has no clothes. No one should be afraid of giving feedback as long as it is given in a measured and considerate way. Petraeus even admitted in one podcast I listened to that one or two times at least in his career, like many officers I guess, he was told by juniors, "Perhaps you should go sit under a tree until that thought had passed." Having read about General Petraeus and listened to him on several podcasts, I get the impression from his command perspective he didn't like yes men or kiss asses. I'm just saying that in my own layman's terms. Later, when in command in Iraq, in order to be more approachable and understand decision-making on the ground, Petraeus would hand out his email to junior officers to contact him with any major concerns. Promoted colonel in 1995, he was assigned to the United Nations mission in Haiti military staff as its chief operations officer during Operation Uphold Democracy. This would give him valuable insight into dealing with various stakeholders such as international and civilian organisations. He then spent time with the 82nd Airborne and after served in the Pentagon as executive assistant to the director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Promoted to one-star Brigadier General, or simply Brigadier as we term it in the UK, in 1999 he returned again to the 82nd Airborne, briefly serving in command. Petraeus would deploy to Kuwait as part of Operation Desert Spring, the ongoing rotation of combat forces through the region during the decade following the Gulf War. In 2000, Petraeus suffered his second major injury when a civilian skydiving jump went wrong. His parachute collapsed at low altitude following a hook turn, resulting in a hard landing that fractured his pelvis. Once again, a determined Petraeus would bounce back from injury. After leaving the 82nd Airborne Division, he served as a Chief of Staff at 18 Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg from 2000 to 2001. He would serve a 10-month tour in Bosnia during Operation Joint Forge, again learning to work with both civilian, multinational and military stakeholders and partners. He would then be promoted Major General. However, it's with the US invasion of Iraq in March 2003 that Petraeus would come into public prominence. As commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Petraeus led the division during the initial invasion of Iraq. Known as the Screaming Eagles, the division provided rapid assault capabilities to support the coalition's advance towards Baghdad. At that point in history, the division consisted of approximately 17,000 personnel and 254 helicopter or air assets, which was 3 times larger than any other division in the world. During the advance, the division secured critical infrastructure and played a key role in fighting around Najaf. Like many soldiers, Petraeus soon got a feeling that things weren't exactly going to plan. He recalled, "Early on, I think probably in the first week or so, I started to realise all the assumptions were not turning out exactly the way they'd been briefed." Alongside the 3rd Mechanised Infantry Division, the 101st formed part of the main western axis of advance, moving through Al-Mathana and Najaf provinces on the approach to Baghdad. The troops battled with harsh desert terrain in addition to enemy forces. Although Petraeus had planned a proposed air assault operation against the BIAP or Baghdad International Airport, the 101st ultimately subordinated its own manoeuvre ambitions to support the 3rd Infantry Division's final armoured thrust into Baghdad. In this role, the division provided attack helicopters as overwatch, artillery support and ground forces, which included an infantry battalion that helped defeat an Iraqi counterattack during the advance. Soon, the 101st would be called on to move north. When the US 4th Infantry Division was unable to enter Iraq via Turkey as planned, northern Iraq lacked a strong conventional US presence. That security vacuum, after the invasion, led to unrest and violence breaking out in the multi-ethnic volatile city of Mosul. In late April-May, 101st received orders to redeploy rapidly from central Iraq to Mosul, a major shift in mission and geography. Petraeus leveraged the division's air assault mobility to insert forces quickly, over a 36-hour period. Petraeus' forces quickly gained control of the battle space and dominated the area. The occupation and stabilisation of Mosul became a defining moment both for the division and David Petraeus. Under his leadership, the division adopted an approach that stood out at the time. The division focused on using small elements living amongst the population and maintained a constant visible presence to deter looting and violence. Petraeus focused quickly on engaging with key leaders to gain greater buy-in and trust, restoring infrastructure such as restoring power, and prioritising civic needs. A sign would hang in the 101st Airborne Division stating, "Will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct?" This was meant by Petraeus to shape how operations were chosen or conducted. If an action was likely to create more enemies than it neutralised, it should be rethought. Petraeus believed that the Allied coalition was unprepared to consolidate the peace and made catastrophically bad decisions, with the coalition provisional authority behind many of them. These included dissolving the Iraqi army and firing civil servants who were low-level Ba'ath Party members. This gave no form of income to former soldiers, and civil servants then couldn't get jobs. With no money coming into the household, many former Iraqi servicemen would either join insurgent groups out of desperation or hire their skills out, such as bomb making, in order to make ends meet. Petraeus disagreed with this policy, and essentially using a combination of diplomatic tact and guile, he tried to keep elements of the Iraqi army in Mosul intact, paying them and using them for security. He thought that excluding local leaders and organisations, in the end, wouldn't lead to long-term success. In contrast to other commanders who would station their troops on large bases, Petraeus would redirect his forces to working and living alongside Iraqis in their own neighbourhoods. These troops would be based in joint security stations or small combat outposts. Petraeus' view was that security, governance and local politics had to be handled together. Whilst others followed rigid top-down policies, he adapted on the ground, focused on protecting civilians and measured success by whether actions reduced future violence rather than created it. The success in the 101st Area of Operations led to much media attention, and Petraeus became one of the most highly visible generals since MacArthur. He would begin to appear in news articles and media interviews. Critics would argue that this relationship with the media amplified Petraeus to more celebrity general and also overhyped his reputation for success. Petraeus would also admit that some of this playing to the media, in hindsight, was perhaps a mistake, especially when he appeared in Newsweek. Personally, I think Petraeus early on knew the power of positive optics, and that having greater public recognition perhaps would give him more influence and clout when dealing with the higher command and achieving the objectives he needed to in his area of operations, especially when many of his policies were going against the grain, so to speak, of the Coalition Provisional Authority. When the 101st ended their rotation, Petraeus would be promoted to Lieutenant General and then appointed the first commander of the Multinational Security Transition Command, Iraq, in June 2004. This newly created command was tasked with training, equipping and mentoring Iraq's growing army, police and other security forces, which were now being rebuilt. This would also include building the essential infrastructure that goes with it, such as training bases, police stations and border forts. By the end of his 15-month tenure, approximately 100,000 Iraqi security forces had been trained, laying the foundation for Iraq's emerging security apparatus. That experience, plus his success with the 101st in Mosul, convinced US leaders that Petraeus was the right commander to attempt a fundamentally different approach to the war, ultimately leading to his selection to command the 2007 surge. Selected for the role and asked to make a series of recommendations to reduce violence, he was then promoted in February 2007 to 4-star general. Petraeus' rapid rise would clearly ruffle a few feathers in army leadership. Some senior officers and Pentagon officials were reportedly surprised and even irritated that a relatively young general would be given such a high-profile, politically sensitive mission. Like any large organisation, when a young thruster starts to emerge, no doubt some of this criticism would have been motivated by professional jealousy. A former ex-senior officer told a journalist, speaking of Petraeus, "He's smart, disciplined, and gets results. That combination makes you both respect him and wish you were him." That said, others would argue that Petraeus during this period would become increasingly self-promoting, courting the media at a time when generals and senior commanders should exercise greater discretion. Having covered Montgomery, Patton and MacArthur in prior videos, I get a sense that some of the criticisms weighed against them are similar ones that Petraeus has faced too. Although, to be fair on Petraeus, he seems a lot more modest than any of those three major prima donnas. Petraeus would take a team of hand-selected senior military advisors with him, all proponents of his view of counterinsurgency. In this team, he would specifically include an Australian lieutenant colonel. Any long-term viewers of this channel will know that we've been going through a mini-series looking at the Australians in Vietnam and their completely different approach to the war than the Americans. It's my guess that Petraeus, when studying for his PhD and in further research, looked heavily into the Australians in Vietnam and tried to apply many of the principles that the Australian task force propagated to the war in Iraq. That's just me speculating, but I've got a gut feeling that could be true. The surge would add 30,000 US troops, initially announced as 5 brigades, but later a 6th was added, and it changed how the war was fought. US forces would copy Petraeus' original model in Mosul and move into neighbourhoods to protect civilians and work alongside and train Iraqi units. The aim was to isolate insurgents from the population and restore basic security. By late 2007, violence had dropped sharply, marking a turning point in the conflict. Petraeus was an inclusive leader who listened to all points of view. One of his mantras was, "Be humble. The people you'll be leading already have on-the-ground conflict experience. Listen and learn." Critics will point out that the success of the surge was due to a variety of factors, and not just Petraeus. The main one being the Sunni awakening and the employment and funding of groups in Anbar in the west of Iraq. This led to a reduction in the violence. Success, they would also say, was judged temporarily. There was no long-term political settlement, and that Iraqi security forces still remained polarised on sectarian grounds. That said, with a limited time frame and resources, I just can't see anyone else placed in that situation doing much better than Petraeus anyway. With limitations and restrictions in place, it was never going to be a mission with permanent success. In 2008, Petraeus was then appointed Commander of US Central Command, CENTCOM, placing him in charge of American military operations across the Middle East and Central Asia. In this role, he oversaw strategy related to Iraq, Afghanistan, and regional security during a period of intense instability. During his time at CENTCOM, Petraeus was also diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer, and he would undergo a couple of months' treatment. In 2010, he was assigned to command US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Although he tried to implement broadly similar counterinsurgency principles that he implemented in Iraq, Afghanistan was a very different kettle of fish. Observers also noted at the time that Petraeus appeared physically exhausted. I guess you have to remember, by this stage, Petraeus had literally spent nearly a decade in extremely high-stress senior command positions, which is bound to take its toll. In 2011, he would step down as commander in Afghanistan and then retire from the army in a transition period where he would be then appointed by President Obama as director of the CIA, with his army career coming to a close. With regards to Petraeus' medals, there are so many that I think it would be another 20-minute video or so if we were to look at all of them. But we have covered most of these awards in prior videos. I've just picked out 3 here of interest. Petraeus was awarded a Bronze Star with a V or Valor device for leadership in Iraq. You can see here the certificate was even signed by William Wallace, no less. Right, that's 2 Mel Gibson cameos in one video. I think that's enough now. 2 others here, foreign awards, which I don't think we've touched on before. A Military Merit Order of the First Class from the United Arab Emirates. I'm speculating now, but was that potentially due to Petraeus' time in CENTCOM? And also the French Military Campaign Medal with, I'm guessing, Afghanistan and possibly ex-Yugoslavia clasps. That's just me guessing now. And then finally, I did notice he had received a gold award of the Iraqi Order of the Date Palm, but I've seen no confirmed images of this medal anywhere on the internet, so if anyone sees one, please let me know. But yeah, that seemed like an interesting award, perhaps for his training of the Iraqi security forces. Although we are purely focusing on Petraeus' military career, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that in 2012, Petraeus would resign from the CIA. This was after an investigation found he had mishandled classified information, bringing his public service career to an abrupt and regrettable end. Of the experience, Petraeus stated, "We will all make mistakes. The key is to recognise them and admit them, to learn from them and to take off the rear-view mirrors, drive on and avoid making them again." Petraeus would then go on to a successful career in the private sector. After many hours listening to podcasts and doing research on the man, I still find Petraeus quite enigmatic. Clearly, he's very skillful at what he does. He's smooth, urbane, and very eloquent in his conversation. To me, he seems more a diplomatic leader, say in the mould of Eisenhower, rather than a swashbuckling leader, say like Patton, who uses the force of his own personality and charisma to get what he wants. Petraeus, he seems definitely more of a deep thinker who wants to look at all angles before he makes decisions. To me, Petraeus seems a product of the modern Western Army, which almost seeks to develop leaders with a more holistic approach to warfare. Intellectually grounded, media savvy, comfortable operating in civilian environments, and politically aware. Since about the 1990s, there has definitely been a clear rise in commanders shaped more in the mould of corporate executives than traditional battlefield generals. For an officer to progress beyond the rank of colonel, in today's military, these traits, I think, are an absolute necessity. I'm not saying it's necessarily good or bad, it's just an observation. Let me know if you disagree or agree in the comments. I've heard Petraeus labelled as the soldier scholar, but to me, in my opinion, I think what's more accurate is perhaps the soldier CEO. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.